Hi everyone, my name is Marcus and you're watching the Reef Nerd YouTube channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about flow. I think one of the most misunderstood, most often ignored, yet possibly most important part of our reef tanks. So the reason why I want to talk about flow today is I've just added 4 additional wave makers to my tank, bringing the total to 6, as well as the 2 outlets from my return pump. So there are 8 points of flow in my tank now. I'm running a grand total of 6 Gyre XF350s. Overkill on a tank this size? I don't think so, and today I'm going to tell you why. So over the years, I've experimented a lot with flow. On my old tank, I ran 3 gyres plus the return outlet. At various times, I also ran other wave makers in random places. I've always been striving to get strong flow in my tank consistently everywhere. And there's a lot of reasons for that. First off, let me list all the benefits that flow provides to our reef tanks. Flow increases coral growth. I have seen this firsthand and demonstrated it in my tanks. There are 2 colonies of Dallas SPS in my tank. This big one here, and then a second one further towards the back. One of those colonies has been with me for 3 years, started this big, and has grown somewhat. The other one has been with me for about 6 to 9 months, started this big, and has quadrupled in size. They're both under the same lighting. They're positioned equally from the Kessel. The only difference is the flow that one of them is receiving. Flow absolutely increases SPS growth. Another benefit to flow is it can actually reduce your tank's nutrients. If you have strong flow wicking across the surface of your sand bed, it really helps prevent the buildup of detritus, keeps a lot of that particle material suspended in the water column where it can eventually be either eaten by your fish or taken down the overflow and removed by your filtration, such as filter socks, roller mats, skimmers, etc. The sand bed often becomes a bit of a time bomb for many tanks, and so preventing that buildup of detritus in the sand bed, or at least reducing how much builds up in the sand bed, can be achieved quite effectively with moderate to strong flow. Now, you do need to caveat that it does require a particular type of sand bed. I honestly don't recommend really fine sand in reef tanks for anybody. It's just not possible to provide sufficient flow to most mixed reef tanks with a really fine sand bed without that sand bed in turn blowing around the tank and creating sand dunes and exposing the glass. So if that's something you don't want to live with, always go for a moderate to coarse sand similar to the one I chose here. Of course, you can always go bare bottom, but that's a whole nother thing, something that I'm not particularly experienced in and something that I've never done personally, but I know many other reefers are going in that direction. But for me, it's not a reef tank without a sand bed, and that's not what I'm interested in. The next major benefit to flow is something that I think a lot of people have probably never actually heard before and may not have actually observed or thought about, but it actually helps get finicky eating fish to eat. There's this obsession, I think partly promoted by the features and marketing material of our wave makers, of feed modes, whereby when you feed the tank, you reduce the flow in the tank, in theory to allow easier capture of the food. But let's stop and think for a minute. That makes absolutely no sense. Where do these fish come from? Most of the fish we keep in the hobby don't come from lagoons with still water. They come from exposed open reefs or places in the ocean where there is strong flow almost all of the time. The ocean doesn't calm down for breakfast. It's always active, and the fish are used to that. It's part of their natural behavior. You might not notice it too much with larger fish like tangs or aggressive eaters that will eat no matter what's going on. But when you get finicky fish and schooling fish like anthias in particular, I've noticed they eat really poorly in slow flow. The behavior I've observed from many different anthias in my tank is that when the flow is low and food particles are hovering in front of them, they either ignore it or they will pounce on it, chew it, and spit it out. And then the next anthier will pounce on it, chew it, and spit it out. However, when the flow is high, the anthiers dart everywhere. Their behavior becomes very clearly a feeding behavior. They pounce on the particles that are whizzing by, and they swallow them, they retain them, and they all eat far more aggressively in stronger flow. And this is an observation that I've seen in my tank, and it's actually a trick that I've used to help get the substantial number of anthiers in my tank now all eating pellet food and flake food, which may not necessarily be a goal unto itself, because I do also constantly feed live foods like mysis and brine as well. I want them to have a rounded diet, and those types of frozen foods will always be part of what I feed to my tank. But it has enabled me to achieve a natural feeding behavior from anthiers on man-made foods, which are really high in nutritional value, which is important for fish like anthiers, which are used to grazing all day, every day, and unfortunately we can't feed our tanks always, all day, every day. Another big advantage to having strong flow in your tank is that it reduces the risk to large colonies, particularly of SPS, from getting bacterial infections. When these kind of infections occur in SPS, they always occur from down near the base of the coral or from a stem that is deep inside the colony. And in my opinion, the reason for this is stagnant water building up over a length of time, not allowing proper nutrient exchange between your nutrient and waste exchange between the coral and the water, which leads to a bacterial infection that can then spread through the entire colony. You can get higher pH in your tank by having more flow, as it promotes more turbulence on the surface of the water and promotes more effective gas exchange. In turn, higher pH, higher growth rate from your coral, more coral health. A growing coral is a happy coral. So we've gone through all these benefits. Flow is fantastic, flow is amazing, you need more flow. Are there any disadvantages to flow? Well, yeah, it can be difficult to achieve properly. You can do flow wrong. Also, it can be a pain if your sand bed is fine. And unfortunately, if you've got a really fine grained sand bed, I can't offer you a solution. There just isn't one. You either have to deal with it, your sand bed moving around to probably the edges of your tank and exposing the glass, or you're going to have to be stuck with a tank with less flow and not achieve any of these benefits. I just strongly recommend people go for a coarser grained sand in the hobby. So how do we achieve fantastic flow in reef tanks? Well, buy the biggest wave maker and turn it to 100%, right? No, absolutely not. That's not the way to do it. Let me tell you why. If you have a really oversized wave maker in your tank and you crank it up high, you're only going to achieve one thing, and that's to have some hotspots in your tank that are achieving really, really high flow, too high flow, to the point where it will damage the corals. Everywhere else in the tank will probably be getting moderate flow, but in a single consistent direction. There'll be no randomization, and that single consistent direction is not natural. That's not something that occurs out on the reefs in the wild. It's not something that corals will like long term. It's going to cause weird growth patterns, which will then in turn lead to dead spots, which will then in turn lead to all the things that happen when there isn't enough flow. So you can't achieve it with one wave maker on max. You always need multiple wave makers. 2 is the bare minimum, but I won't say it's acceptable. I think reef tanks need more than 2 points of water flow, because all you can achieve with 2 points of water flow is a gyre effect, which is where all the water in the tank is moving in a consistent direction, or you can reverse it and have it moving in the opposite direction, or you can have them opposing, which is where you cause 2 smaller gyres to intersect. So you've really only got 3 flow patterns available to you in a tank with 2 wave makers. And it's just not enough. That is not what I'd call randomized flow. Most of the features on our wave makers, things like crest modes and pulsing modes, or where they ramp up slowly, then they ramp up quickly, then they ramp up slowly, these are, in my opinion, poor efforts working against physics to try to create randomized flow out of 1 or 2 single points of flow generation. And whilst they can have some limited success, they're often not great. In my opinion, the best way to create randomized flow is to have as many sources of flow as possible that will intersect and then create complex fluid dynamics that cause random water movements despite there being consistent points of flow generation. So to that end, I now have 8 points of flow generation in my tank. There's the 2 wave makers up the top, pretty standard. They're the horizontal ones shooting across the tank. But now I have 4 along the back. These are 4 vertical mounted gyres, each opposing each other on either side of my weir and then on either side of the left and right glass. Beyond that, I have the 2 outlets of my return pump, both with random flow nozzles on them. Having all of these running consistently at a moderate flow level has created some very crazy flow patterns in my tank that are often changing and intersecting and fighting against each other. This is how you create randomized flow. So I would recommend to anyone that the choice between 4 cheap wave makers or 2 expensive wave makers, go with the 4 cheap ones every time. I get that SIX Gyre XF350s is not for everyone. It's a very overkill mentality or an expensive way to do it. And I have to admit, it was too expensive for me as well. I didn't pay full retail for all these gyres. I've been collecting them on Facebook Marketplace over quite a long time. So I put in a fair bit of effort to achieve this from my personal tank. But I could have achieved the same thing on a really modest budget by going with smaller, cheaper wave makers, the Tons Nano Streams. I could have had 4 or 5 of those spread across the tank. The AC version doesn't even need a controller, they just plug straight into the wall. The DC version, a little bit more expensive, but comes with a really tiny controller, which gives you everything you need. And there's a bunch of accessories for them as well, battery backups and all this kind of stuff. And there's a heap of other brands out there as well. Then there's if you don't like gyres, which put out a big wide rectangle of flow, then all the smaller, more traditional round wave makers put out a circular cone-shaped pattern of flow. Ultimately, I don't think it makes a huge difference. Go with whichever wave maker style suits you best or what you like the look of in your tank. But I'd always recommend multiple smaller wave makers is far superior than 1 or 2 big ones. I have all of these wave makers across the back set to 40% running constantly. I don't bother running them in reverse because the reverse modes, in my opinion, are pretty rubbish on gyres. You basically use twice the power to generate half the flow in the opposite direction. You're just running a propeller backwards, that's all you're doing. It's not optimal. The same goes for your more traditional round style of wave maker. If they have a reverse mode, use it sparingly. It doesn't really do a lot other than just reversing the direction. You'd be better off just lowering the intensity on one side of the tank and increasing the intensity on the other, and then reversing that again. You'll have the same effect and use a lot less power to do it. So let's get to the real concern point that I think a lot of people have, and that is, how do you know if you're giving your corals enough flow or too much flow? Well, let me be really simple about it. If a polyp is not moving, it is not getting enough flow. Simple as that. If we're looking at SPS with really small polyps, it requires more flow to get those polyps moving. SPS corals have like a slime layer over them. It's invisible, but it's certainly there. And if you've ever touched SPS, you definitely know about it. It takes a fair bit of flow to penetrate this slime layer, and that is intentional. The slime layer is where the corals breed a lot of bacteria that they use for food. It's where they create their own micro farming, essentially, for their own health. But it requires constant flow across it to allow the exchange of waste and nutrients between the coral and the water column. So you need enough flow to penetrate that slime layer and allow the polyps to move and shake. You want to see a semi-aggressive shaking of the polyps on all SPS coral. If the polyps are not out, it's possibly because the coral is in stagnant water and not getting any flow. When we're talking LPS corals, they require a little bit less flow, but probably more than you think. A very gentle waving of LPS coral, like hammers and torches, is not enough in my opinion. You want a more aggressive swaying. Not a full-blown, like wiggly man in the wind, but you want a fairly aggressive sway. Enough to allow water to penetrate underneath the large polyp of an LPS coral, like a torch or a hammer, and work its way around the base. Tissue recession on LPS is most commonly due to two things, in my opinion. The wrong nutrient profile, definitely something that most people know about. LPS coral need a bit of nutrient in the water or their tissues recede quite quickly. But long term also, they still need the same flow as SPS corals around their base, or it can lead to bacterial infections or tissue recession around the base. There's a confirmation bias that some people get with LPS where they give them low flow and the coral puffs up, and they think that that's good. It isn't actually always good. The coral puffs up because it is trying to increase its surface area. It's trying to increase its surface area because it's not getting enough nutrient and gas exchange with the water column. It's actually starved for flow when they puff up in a particular way. You can also sometimes see that people will turn up their flow for the first time, and all of a sudden a torch that's been, say, fairly lazy and lax and its tentacles have been drooping over itself will now have the tentacles up in the air due to the flow, and you can see around the base and the skeleton of that torch, for example, and you've exposed tissue recession that was already there. But to some reefers, they may misinterpret that and say, oh, the flow has caused this tissue recession on my LPS polyp. I'm sorry, no, it's unlikely that it has. Yes, it is possible to give too much flow to LPS to the point where the polyp might be torn from the skeleton. However, that should be abundantly obvious that it's the cause, because it will look like a flag in the wind as opposed to just waving around. All you've done is uncovered a problem that was already there, and now you're aware of it. So if you're a reefer that's already been relying on just your two wave makers, one on each side, for a really long time, I'd strongly encourage you, go on eBay and buy the cheapest wave maker you can find and just add it to a corner of your tank and point it towards the center to just add that extra flow pattern that's going to randomize things. Buy two of them if they're really cheap. I promise you, you'll see results. You'll see your alkalinity drop a bit and your calcium drop a bit because your coral's uptake will increase. You'll see coral growth increase, and you'll see your pH increase. You might even see increased polyp extension as well. Certainly, my Dallas at the back there that was in low flow for a long time has far lower polyp extension than my Dallas at the front here that's exposed to much stronger flow. Even corals like scolies and trackies require moderate flow. They need enough flow to be able to wick away any sand or detritus that lands inside them. They need enough flow so that when they're in feeding mode and their tentacles come out, those tentacles are moving. It's really easy to fall into a trap with corals that express no movement under normal conditions, that therefore they can deal with dead zones or no flow. Really, they can't. There's no coral that can. As reefers, we often obsess to the nth degree about things like lighting, what brand of skimmer to use, what products, what salt to use, and things like that, when ultimately, I think you can have success with almost anything, with almost all the products on the market in those categories. But with flow, there seems to be this thing where people just pick the wave maker that they like the look of, buy one or two of them, put them on each end of their tank, set it on a particular mode, and then never touch it again. And unfortunately, that's not good enough. Flow is the thing I think we should be obsessing about. It's more important than lighting. It's more important than what brand of salt you use. It's probably the most important factor in our reef tanks, as it affects almost everything. And when you think about it, it makes sense. In the wild, flow is the most wild and variable factor that is consistently wild and variable in the natural habitat of the creatures we keep in our reef tanks. Anyway, tell me your thoughts about flow in the comments down below. Have I inspired you to add some more wave makers to your tank? Have I inspired you to crank up the flow a bit more and see what effects it can have? I promise you, increasing the flow within reason, there's only benefits to be gained. Anyway, hit the subscribe button, like the video and comment down below. My name is Marcus and you've been watching the Reef Nerd YouTube channel. Bye for now.